Principles of Economics, my complete guide to understanding economics, is now available in hardcover, audiobook, and ebook from Saifedean.com, Amazon, and many more booksellers worldwide. And now I am also teaching a course based on this book on my website, Saifedean.com. Principles of Economics will run the whole academic year, from September to June, and will have a new lecture every 2 weeks, as well as weekly live online discussion seminars open to learners from all over the world and from all walks of life. Whether you're a student, a professional, or a retiree, you are making economic decisions every day, and this course will arm you with the wisdom of centuries of economists to improve your economic decision making. You'll also get a free book of Principles of Economics if you sign up for the course. Go to saifedean.com and sign up now. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by Orange Pill app, the Bitcoin-only social network that connects you with high-signal Bitcoiners, events, and now merchants as well. If you're like me and can't stop talking about Bitcoin, you know how challenging it can be to talk to the no-coiners and how nice it is to talk to someone who gets you. With the Orange Pill app, you can find the Bitcoiners near you and they can replace the no-coiners in your life. You can organize events and meetups with local Bitcoiners, and wherever you travel, you can meet up with local Bitcoiners, all while being as anonymous as you like. So if you want to build your local network of Bitcoiners, find a Bitcoin meetup or merchants accepting Bitcoin, head over to orangepillapp.com to sign up, or download the app from the App Store or Google Play Store and send me a DM so we can get connected. This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently. Hello, welcome to the Bitcoin Standard podcast. Our guest today is Dan Cohen. Dan is the founder of Uncaptured Media. It's a multimedia investigative journalism platform. He's also a documentary filmmaker, and he's made multiple films about Gaza, including the award-winning documentary Killing Gaza. His latest feature film is called Haiti, Intervention versus Revolution. I've noticed Dan's been very outspoken on the situation in Palestine since the October 7 attacks. And I've really appreciated a lot of the insight that he's brought in. He's somebody who's traveled to Gaza and spent a lot of time there. And so I thought it would be very interesting to discuss this with him because he brings a very, very fresh perspective on the issue. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
All right, so let's begin from the beginning. What got you interested in Palestine out of all the places and all the things that you could be interested in the world?
Well, I mean, initially, one of the reasons, I was thinking about getting into journalism, and I had sort of developed a working knowledge of the situation in Palestine. And part of the motivation for me was, frankly, I was angry that I was lied to. Um, most, I was raised in a pretty secular Jewish American household, and we are taught that Israel is our homeland. It's some kind of liberal paradise where Jews can live, and there's no anti-Semitism, and everyone is happy, and it's great. And I went there, and I, as an adult, and found it to be the complete opposite. It was an apartheid situation. Um, Israeli society is extremely racist. All of the sort of values that I was raised to hold as kind of a liberal leaning American, I found it was a total lie, everything I was told. So I figured it was a place that I could develop myself as a journalist. I sort of, had a good understanding of what was going on already, and it was a place that had some sort of personal meaning for me, just because I was told this was my home away from home or something like that. And so that was the initial thing. But I think it's such an important place. It's what's happening there has such a great impact on the rest of the world that I've stayed focused on it for as long as I've been in journalism.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, was it Birthright? Was it a Birthright trip the first time you went there?
Not the first time. The first time I went was my bar mitzvah when I was, turned 13. Um, my grandfather took my entire dad's side of the family to tour around for a month, and so we had my bar mitzvah at the Western Wall and occupied Jerusalem, and did the whole family trip, which didn't like resonate with me. It didn't like make me a Zionist or anything. Not that I really knew what the term meant at that point, but by the time I was in college, I was actually finishing college, and a friend of mine was trying to convince me to go on Birthright, and I said, and I was totally opposed, and I figured the only way I would go is if I just went to see the occupation afterwards, which I had never seen, and so I did that. So the Birthright trip itself was horrible, very fascist, overtly sexual, and I couldn't wait to get off of that thing. And then I spent a few weeks seeing uh, the occupation, going to the West Bank, going to Hebron, going through different checkpoints, talking to Palestinians, and that was another thing that really solidified my understanding. So it sort of, I think, Birthright backfired with me.
Yeah, I think it has that impact. It can either turn people into complete NPC zombies that just become completely incapable of ever disagreeing with whatever the prime minister of Israel, whoever it is in power, or just turns them off. And know so many people that just went there and thought, I have a nice home in New Jersey. Why are these people trying to recruit me into this religious war and to kill all of these people and kick them out of their
Right.
homes? And yeah, but can you tell us a little bit more about Birthright for those for the listeners who are not very familiar? So what happens in those trips? First of all, it's free, right? You don't have to pay anything. So there's an enormous budget out there just to give money to random 18, 20-year-old Americans to travel to Palestine to try and convince them that that is their homeland, not the homeland of the Palestinians who have been there for hundreds or thousands of years. So how does that go?
Right, exactly. It's just pure Zionist indoctrination. So they'll take different types of Jews, mostly from the United States and Canada, I think from Europe too, but from Western countries where Israel relies on political support, and so they want you to essentially come away from that trip. It's a 10-day trip, all expenses paid, as long as you don't sort of cause trouble. They can kick you off the trip and make you pay for it. So um, there's there's certain boundaries they don't want you to cross, and so I don't know how many youth they bring every year, but it's sort of among especially secular Jews in the United States, it's a lot of college age kids do it, and so they take you for 10 days, tour you all over the country. You only sleep a few hours a night. It's they tailor it for different sort of backgrounds. So if you're there's like the outdoorsy one. That's the one I went on. There's others that are more religious. They so there's all kinds of trips, and it's basically kind of brainwashing. I mean, when you're on very little sleep, that's a part of the kind of brainwashing experience. It's also hypersexual. I mean, as if 19, 20, 21-year-old kids. I mean, basically, they you all have your own hotel rooms. There's very little supervision, and they explicitly encourage you to hook up, as if young like 20-year-olds need more encouragement, and so they've the CEO of Birthright, Michael Steinhardt, has explicitly said that's part of the point. So they want you basically to either they would love for you to move to Israel, or to at least be supportive. And so, for example, I had a cousin who went on Birthright a few years younger than me. She was not raised in any way Jewish, but I guess both of her parents were Jewish. And she went on Birthright and came back totally like a hardcore Zionist, very pro Netanyahu. Um, and that's the success story of Birthright. So um, it's basically it's like taking you to like a like Zionist Disneyland, and yeah.
Yeah, I think this is the way it works, and it's just getting all this fun experiences and hookups and all of that stuff to try and associate Israel with fun in people's minds, and then all of the propaganda about the Palestinians just being evil people who just want to come after us because we're trying to have fun, and they don't want us to have fun because they hate us, and it's inexplicable, and so send us more money and weapons.
Right, 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 exactly. And yeah, they give, political it's not as if they avoid politics. They took us to some kind of seminar where the guy talked about what's going on with the Palestinians, and it was just pure Hasbara propaganda. But people eat it up, So I mean, I remember one guy who I met on the trip who actually went to the same university as me in Tucson, Arizona, and he was kind of a yahoo, didn't know what he was doing with himself. I think he got into a lot of fights, and was not a real good guy, and he decided to join the Israeli army. So, it's it attracts there's it takes like lost Jewish Americans and gives them some sense of identity and purpose. That's what a lot of what Zionism is, really.
Yeah, and I think that's very astute because I think, I mean, growing up in America right now, there's there's a clear, you could call it crisis of meaning or crisis of identity. What does it even mean to be an American? I think an interesting point made the other day. Remember when the U.S. assassinated Qasem Soleimani, some Iranian a journalist, I think it was, or a leader, I'm not sure, but he said, "Well, this puts us in an awkward position. We'd like to assassinate someone like Qasem Soleimani for the Americans, but they don't have a Qasem Soleimani. Who are we supposed to assassinate? SpongeBob SquarePants or somebody like that?" So I think there's an element of that in that if you're an American, the idea of America by this kind of toxic version of liberalism, where liberalism is self-negation and self-denial. You can't have an identity. You can't say you can't take pride in what you are, and uh, any kind of sense of belonging to America is interpreted in a way that is racist. And so that vacuum is there for everybody, and then that makes something like Birthright attractive because hey, you can belong to something. You can raise a flag and shout shout the national anthem at the top of your voice and nobody will call you racist because obviously all of these things don't apply for Israel. They only apply for America. So then that's part of the appeal, I think, in why a lot of people get drawn into this scam of Zionism.
Right, right, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that. You I don't know, live in New York City and just have some job, and you make your money and go home, and that's it. But you don't have any identity or sense of belonging or purpose, and you just people don't have their family. They're spread throughout the country. It's all just kind of like I think that's a lot of Western sort of society in general. And so then you're susceptible to exactly the scam of in this case Zionism.
Yeah. So then, all right. So, how did you then break out of? So on the same Birthright trip, after the trip you finished, and then you went to the West Bank.
Yeah, I went to East Jerusalem. I went to the West Bank. At that time, there were a lot of protests in Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem that was is slowly being ethnically cleansed. And there was a lot of protest activity, not only from Palestinians, but you'd get like left wing Israelis joining in and internationals, and so that was a sort of pretty accessible uh, example of occupation. And then going to Hebron was really shocking. I mean, that's the most visible form of apartheid you see. And so I just spent like probably 3 weeks just touring all over the West Bank, and it was just totally shocking. I mean, any American who is raised with the idea that people are equal, that racism is bad. I mean, if you go there, it's just so overt and blatant that there's no way to avoid it.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, tell us a little bit more about Hebron. What was your experience like there? First of all, what year was this?
This was the first time I went there was 2010, just after, like, early 2010, January.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I just saw not only in Hebron, but all over. When I was on Birthright, for example, on, Friday night, Shabbat, they told us to go ask Israelis, "What does Shabbat mean to you?" And so, we broke up into groups and we went around and we encountered some people and asked them, "What does Shabbat mean to you?" And the guy, it's like a father and a husband and wife, and I think they had a kid with them. And the guy answers me in like an American accent. He answers us in an American accent. "Oh, go for a walk and do this." And I said, Where are you from?" And he said, "Baltimore." It's like, so you're an American. And I was already like politicized. I was already anti-Zionist at that point, and so also it was during the time of Gilad Shalit, when the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit was held captive. He was a prisoner of war in Gaza. He had been taken captive, I believe, in 2000. I want to say 6, and in 2011 he was released in exchange for about 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, a little more than 1,000 of them. Um, and so I asked, what should Israel do about Gilad Shalit? And he told me, the first day that Gilad is not back with us, we delete one neighborhood in Gaza. The second day, we delete two neighborhoods in Gaza. The third day, three. And that was just, it was just such a shocking thing for, to hear. And it's just, he's an American too. So it's even more like absurd and just racist and genocidal. So when we got back on Birthright to, the group where we talk about what did people say, I told them, and people booed me. Actually, people on the group booed me because they don't want to hear that kind of uncomfortable thing. So, I mean, there was, it's not only Hebron; it's just everywhere. It's just genocidal ideology pulsing through the veins of that society. But Hebron, I mean, it's, known to have very fanatical settlers. It's the largest Palestinian city in the West Bank, and in the heart of it, in the old city of Hebron, there is a Zionist settlement in so you have a few hundred Israeli settlers surrounded by several hundred, Israeli soldiers, and Palestinians are ethnically cleansed. You have entire streets that are shut down where Palestinians used to live there. You have, streets where one, say, 25% is for Palestinians, and the other 75% is Jewish only. So it's just the most blatant form of apartheid. Now, you have these huge checkpoints that Palestinians have to go through that are like a series of cages. Now you have automatic, um, or remote control guns that fire tear gas, which I had actually, those were installed more recently, a few years ago. I used to see the same thing in Gaza on the borders, on the rather the walls of the Gaza Strip. The Israelis installed remote control machine guns. So those were lethal. And I saw those fire at people, at farmers, people walking anywhere near the walls. You'd see these remote control machine guns, open fire on them. So they there's a sort of lighter version of that, a non-lethal, fires tear gas in Hebron. But it's just so dystopic that uh there's no, if you're a half decent person, then there's no other takeaway than this is just the most explicit, clear form of apartheid that you'll see in basically the whole country, short of maybe going to Gaza. But it's, in Gaza, the Palestinians are like separated, from, it's like a big concentration camp, so you don't see it quite as uh direct in a way.
Yeah, no, Hebron is something else because, yeah, in Gaza at least there's a clear separating line. The Israelis control everything, but at least they don't intermingle. There aren't settlers
Right.
in Gaza, but in Hebron, they steal land and homes, and then they just, well, there's a home that now belongs to a settler, and then there's a military that needs to move in order to secure the settlers. So then the military, they need to take somebody's home in order to secure it, and then the military need another home, and then another family moves in, and then you've got, what is it now, maybe 500, or I think, or 1,000 settlers in Hebron, something like that, very tiny number in a city of tens of thousands of Palestinians. But the entire city is a series of labyrinths and cages, all so that you can allow the essentially thieves to continue to steal more and more Palestinian land without the Palestinians doing anything about it. And I mean, the kind of fanaticism it takes to go and steal somebody's home and then live in their town and get a military presence in order to try and kick them out of their homes, in order to try and move everybody out of the home. This is all of the stories you hear about how horrible and how fanatic Israeli settlers are. The ones in Hebron are on a whole other level. So the stories that you hear, I mean, they're not believable. You can't really believe that people in the 21st century could behave in this absolutely barbaric way of just constantly throwing their dirt from their own windows down onto the homes of the Palestinians, so that they make life for Palestinians impossible, so that the Palestinians leave. This is really the point. And it's just continues to get worse, and it continues to get supported more and more by the government, by the Israeli government. The Israeli government is doing everything to support these people. So this is the ridiculous thing that, the idiots who support Israel based on these moronic propaganda that they get in American TV, where they put up, the nice looking actors and actresses who speak good English and talk about Israel wants peace. They never mention this stuff. And if you do mention it to them, well, they just pass off something like, oh, well, we condemn that, or, well, it's a result of the Palestinians doing this and this and that. But of course, it's not just something you can paper over if you're living there as a Palestinian. If you're in the US and you're just trying to rationalize the fact that your country's been completely hijacked by Zionists, then you can brush it off as, oh, well, I don't support that, but I still support giving them all the money they need. Well, the money they need is what's going to do that. And so if you consider yourself in any way a decent person, and you support Israel, you are an insanely confused person. There's no way around it. There is no sense of decency about this. And I think if you were to try and put any kind of thought experiment to any of those people, this is where they turn off and they don't want to have any kind of discussion. Is, well, what happens if this was your neighborhood? What happens if people moved into your neighborhood and started acting in the same way? And it's, to be honest with you, this is why I could never quite take seriously any of the identity politics and racism drama that happens in the US. I mean, as a kid who grew up in the West Bank, I come to the US and people are upset because somebody called them a word that they don't like. And they're having arguments about whether this word is okay or that word is not okay. And all I can think of is, until you get kicked out of your home because you believe in the wrong God, all of your problems are completely inconsequential, and I don't really care to listen about them.
Yeah. Where'd you grow up? In the West Bank?
Ramallah.
Oh, okay. Alright, I lived in
Yeah.
Ramallah. Yeah,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
course. Yeah.
What years?
Uh, so I moved to Ramallah, like, I think late in 2014, and then I was kind of I had an apartment there for a while. 2014, 15, 16, I was kind of in and out of Ramallah, and 17.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so, I mean, I would be back and forth. I just found Ramallah was kind of the easiest place for me to stay in a way. It's
Yeah.
it's the bubble, I mean, so it's like I didn't have to live around Israelis. It was comfortable enough. There's of course a lot of internationals there. There's restaurants, etc. So, but I mean, Ramallah is now, at least. I mean, I don't know how it was when you were growing up, but I guess post Oslo, it's been turned into sort of a bubble.
Yeah, it is a bubble, and it could, I mean, people who get who have to leave their homes in the small villages, who have their land stolen by the settlers and by the army, they all end up essentially congregating. Well, not all, but a lot of it is in Ramallah. So there's an enormous influx of new people always coming into the town, and of course, like everything in the West Bank is completely dysfunctional because it's completely suffocated and surrounded from all sides by settlements and roads, and there's no room for expansion. There's no room for building infrastructure, and of course, that's all by design. They want to make life as difficult as possible for people. So, how was it living in Ramallah and traveling in Gaza and the West Bank and Hebron with a name like Cohen? Tell us about that.
I mean, I never had any trouble really. I mean, in fact, there was one time I was at a protest in Nabi Saleh, which I'm sure is a village not too far from Ramallah, that had protests every Friday, where that's of course the traditional protest day, and people in different villages in in the West Bank, or would go and protest. But Nabi Saleh really kept it up for years and years and years. And that's, if your followers know who Ahid Tamimi is, she's, somewhat of an icon. She and her father Bassem Tamimi are from Nabi Saleh. So one time I was in Nabi Saleh for a protest, and we got arrested by Israeli soldiers. And when they saw my name, they were really shocked. So they consider me like a race traitor. Um, so but I mean, I never had any issue with Palestinians. And even though, you'd hear like Palestinians use the Yahud, like Jew, for Israeli, they don't mean it in the same way like, European or American, like anti-Semites would. They just it's like Jew is not like a I mean, I don't it's like I don't need to tell you, obviously. I'm speaking more to your audience, but like Jew is not a bad word for them necessarily. Um so and they understand. I found that Palestinians by and large understand the difference between Jew and Zionist, and Israeli. So they never had a problem with me as a Jew. In fact, when I was in Gaza, there were a couple instances where I felt compelled to tell people that I had met that I was Jewish, because I really want them to understand that their conflict is, not with Jews per se. It's with the political ideology of Zionism. And they understood that. They had no problem with that. Even young guys, in like the rubble of Shijaiya, which was a neighborhood that was largely, large swaths of it were wiped out in 2014, and huge massacres were carried out there. And now, I mean, I don't know if there's really anything left of it. It's been totally decimated in this current genocide. But in the aftermath of 2014, I spent a fair amount of time there, and there were young guys like 14 years old who I sat and talked with, and they understood that I was Jewish, and they didn't care. One of them invited me to his wedding, so it's just they're salt of the earth people. They're not like racists. They're just trying to live, and I never had any issue. And even Hamas actually brought me in their security office, and they said, "Listen, we know you've told some people you're Jewish. Don't do that just for your own security." You never know how someone's going to react. And in Gaza, there has been a very, very small percentage, but of Salafi extremists who might do something. So, I mean, it's definitely something that like is not wise to advertise in a situation like that. But Hamas went out of its way to tell me stop doing that, because it makes us harder to protect you.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think this is something that's very difficult for foreigners to grasp, because the entire idea is there's just this inexplicable amount of rage against Jews for being Jews, which is completely inexplicable and completely mysterious, and somehow has nothing to do with the fact that 90% of the land and the population of this country was not Jewish, and then a nationalist movement decided to build a homeland there for foreigners. And it's just really absurd when people accuse Palestinians of being anti-Semitic, because I mean, if it was French people or Chinese people or Hindu people or Bolivian people who decided to have a national homeland in Palestine, I promise you, we wouldn't be so concerned about Judaism or Zionists. We wouldn't be our problem wouldn't be with Zionists. It would be with the Bolivians or the Hindus or whatever it is. It's completely absurd. In their mind. It's just no, all of this, the fact that they've stolen your land for 80 years, and they've been stealing land and mass murdering people for 80 years is completely coincidental to the fact that you're just happen to hate Jews. You just hate Jews, and that's why you couldn't coexist with a national homeland of Jews that kicks you out of your home. And so that's why they had to kick you out of your home. That's kind of how the logic goes. But of course, the reality of it is of course very different, because Jews had always lived in Palestine since the Islamic conquest. So Historically, very few people know this, but historically, the Romans had expelled the Jews from Jerusalem and the surroundings of Jerusalem, not all of Palestine, but most of it. But it was Umar ibn al-Khattab, the Islamic caliph, who entered Jerusalem with a Jewish scholar from Arabia. He brought him with him specifically so that they could go into Jerusalem and identify the temple. And they figured out where the temple was because the Romans had turned it into a trash dump for 5 centuries. So the Muslims figured out where the temple was. They allowed the Jews back into Jerusalem, and they cleaned up the temple, and they built a mosque on the temple, and they allowed the Jews to pray there. And the Jewish population of Palestine has lived there since then, and they've had the right to own property. And this has been the case throughout all of the different rulers that have come. So it was the initial Muslim rulers and so many different rulers that come, the Mamluks and the Ottomans and so on. But all along, there were Muslims, there were Jews, there were Christians. And I think the key point that really bothers the Zionists is that the reality of the matter is that the population that remained in Palestine was predominantly the native population that has always been there. So there's always been migrations in and out, but and some Arabs did come with the Muslims, but the majority of the population was still local. There was no population transfer when the Arabs came in. They weren't like the Zionists where they wanted to kick out the local population. They kicked out the Roman rulers, so they expelled the Romans, but they allowed the Jews to go back in, and they kept the Christians there, and they allowed the Christians to remain Christians. And over time, a lot of the local population converted to Islam, and the Muslims became a majority. But it was never illegal to be Christian or be Muslim, and it was never there was never any kind of real discrimination when it comes to property rights. You could own land, you can buy land, you can sell land, and that's of course how all of these Zionists immigrants who came to Palestine before 1948 could buy land, which incidentally they can't do anymore because now the land is owned by the socialist government of Israel, which holds all the land and leases it to people. It doesn't sell it because they don't want non-Jews to own it. So they want to make sure that it remains owned by the state, and that's ultimately what Israel is. It's a sectarian land ownership bureaucracy that has a military that steals lands for it, and has a PR arm that hoodwinks and suckers Americans into financing the theft. That's basically it.
Right. Right. I mean, there was I'm sure you know this, there was a um Zionists, I mean, in Hebron in particular, if you walk around the Zionist areas of Hebron, you will see these murals where they talk about what happened to the Jewish community in 1929. And they'll say they were wiped out by the Arabs, they were massacred, they were killed, they were subjected to pogroms. And the reality of what happened is a bit more complex than that. It was actually because of Zionist provocations. They were basically trying to create sectarian divisions among Palestinians. You had Palestinian Jews, of course, and they were a minority, but they, as you were describing, lived fine, lived in harmony with the Muslim majority as well as the Christians. They're part of the fabric of Palestinian society. And Zionist provocations, in order to create this sectarian divide, resulted. Basically, they were the revisionist movement, the Jabotinsky Beitar youth, were trying to agitate around the holy sites. In particular, at that time, was around the Western Wall, which is holy to Muslims, the Al Burak Wall, right, or Al Burak, where Muslims believe that I think Muhammad had his horse when right, is that right? I believe. I don't know if I don't know if you're familiar with that, but so Zionists were agitating at what is now known as commonly known as the Western Wall, and this uh, basically there were also some of the revisionist leaders who were talking about taking over the Al-Aqsa compound, what is known to Jews as the Temple Mount, and so that what was a sort of half true rumor spread. There was a small minority of Zionists who were talking about it, but that spread around, and so that became the Jews are trying to do this, and so that led to basically. intercommunal violence between the religious groups, and that led to the destruction of the Palestinian Jewish community in Hebron as a result of these Zionist provocations. And so, these settlers, these fanatical settlers, pretend that they were targeted, just for being Jews, and there were no reason, but they don't want to talk about that Zionists actually started this intentionally in order to create this violence.
Yeah, I came across this interesting story from this Jewish rabbi from Poland who, in 1747, moved to Hebron, and there was a small Jewish community in Hebron in at that time. And this was a Jew from Poland who was writing about the experience of Jews and the life of Jews in Hebron. And he described it. He says, in this holy city, there's a Jewish courtyard which they close during the Sabbath and festivals. No one can come in or out all night, and they are almost not afraid. And when there is a celebration, such as circumcision or some other occasion, the Muslim elders come and all rejoice. And it's not only this, but the local Gentiles, even the great ones, love the Jews very much. And whenever there's a celebration, their leaders come to celebrate with the Jews and dance with the Jews, almost exactly just like the Jews. And he just keeps talking about how he came there. The city's highest officer greeted me, and I gave him a nice book I had from Istanbul. And all of these nice things were happening to him. And he was describing just how nice life was there. And it's amazing. All of this stuff just completely gets left out. There's a 1300-year history of Muslims and Jews coexisting and Christians coexisting in Palestine, which is not convenient. And then they choose from this 1300-year history to highlight any single bad thing that has ever happened for anybody, and then just take that as if it was the exception. But the reality of the matter is, you were better off being a Jew or Muslim in Palestine before 1948. You had more rights back then than you do being a Palestinian in Gaza or in Hebron or in Ramallah today. It's not even comparable. There were no walls around you preventing you from moving around based on your religion or ethnicity. That there were no people taking your property just because you belonged to the wrong religion, which is essentially what is going on. And this I think this is the most important point that people miss. This is something that the media does not never focuses on, but this is what the experience of Zionism is like for the Palestinian. And you have to think about what the experience of Zionism matters for the Palestinian, because the Palestinians are the victims of Zionism. They're the ones who are on the receiving end. And so you can't judge Zionism by how it treats the beneficiaries and ignore what it does to the victims, because that's a little bit like saying, well, me stealing your stuff might be bad for you, but on the plus side, it's good for me. So I guess it's a wash. So therefore, me being a thief is okay. That's exactly what people sound like when they discount the Palestinian experience. No, the Palestinian experience is not something you can discount, because they're the victims. There's a crime being committed. They're being stolen. Their land is being stolen. And this is it. This is the experience for a Palestinian. It's theft. You have witnessed 8 decades of losing your land, losing your property, and as we're seeing in Gaza right now, all kinds of other theft as well, where soldiers go into houses and steal things, and they go into banks and steal stuff. They go into jewelry shops and steal the jewelry. It's the quintessential experience of Zionism is theft of Palestinian property. This is what it's been like. And of course, this is not what your stupid TV focuses on, and this is not what your propaganda wants to tell you, and this is not what all of your favorite pro-Israel influencers are paid to tell you about Israel. But that's what it is about. And when you ignore that and focus on, oh well, Israel has a tech scene, Israel has a nice gay pride parade, or Israel has got nice beaches or something like that, you're being completely ridiculous. There's no other way of putting it.
Right, right. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's a big lie. And then I mean, the other big lie about Zionism is that they'll tell you, the media, or even, the US government, for example, will tell you that Zionism is Judaism. A few months ago, they passed a resolution declaring that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Um, if which implies that if anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, then Zionism is Semitism or Judaism, which is which is the only people who believe that Judaism equals Zionism are Zionists and anti Semites, those who hate Jews. They both accept the same premise. And so that's being passed by the US Congress, which, that's an official position of the US Congress, which is an incredible statement because there are huge Jewish community. Not only is it false, uh, there are, Judaism is a religion that's thousands of years old. Zionism is a political nationalist ideology that's about 150 years old. So it's just a bald faced lie. But there are also huge, huge Jewish communities, religious Jewish communities that are well, what they'll say is it's not even that we are anti-Zionist, it's that we are pro-Torah, and Zionism is against the Torah, because Zionism from the start, Zi- the Torah, which is, the book of Judaism, uh, it's completely nationalism is forbidden. There is no such thing in Judaism as as Jewish nationalism. It's a complete invention of Zionists that is absolutely forbidden. And that is, so it doesn't exist. So these huge Jewish communities of, many thousands of people are being told by their own Congress that you're not really American. You're Zionist. You have actually an allegiance to another country, to the Zionist project of Israel. So it's totally anti-Semitic, and it's, what I say is Zionism is the highest form of anti-Semitism. It's like, these are the real self-hating Jews, who take all the anti-Semitic tropes from Europe, about, Jews being conniving and evil, and controlling wealth and politics and all these things, and they become like a stereotype of that. They basically embody those stereotypes.
The syllabus for my new online economics course, Principles of Economics, is now available on Saifedean.com. The course will take place over 18 lectures, each based on one chapter from my new book, Principles of Economics, which will be available for free as an ebook for everyone registering for the course. Lectures will be released once every 2 weeks on Mondays, starting on the 25th of September 2023, and will be available in video and audio format. Live discussion seminars will be held once a week on Thursdays at alternating time slots, 12 hours apart, to ensure learners can attend from all over the world. I'm happy to announce that I have set up my new publishing house and online bookstore, The Safe House, which will be publishing and delivering the best Bitcoin and Austrian economics books worldwide in hardcover, audiobook, and ebook formats. Go to thesafehouse.com to buy my latest book, Principles of Economics, as well as the Fiat Standard and the Bitcoin Standard. And now I'm also publishing Fiat Food, Matthew Lysiak's amazing investigation into how inflation ruined our diet and health. And I'm also publishing Lynn Alden's Broken Money, her masterful exploration of the failures of the global financial system and how Bitcoin fixes it. This is a Bitcoiner's bookshop, so the books are printed in beautiful cloth hardcover made to last, with an ice-colored dust jacket on top. Go to thesafehouse.com and get yours now.
And we see today that there is increasing anti-Semitism. When I look on Twitter and I see how many people are like railing against Jewish control of politics and of media, of our systems. The three presidential candidates we have here in the United States, Trump, Biden, and Kennedy, they're all Zionists. Well, if you think that Zionism and Judaism are the same, then it looks like they're all under Jewish control. But the fact is, they are under the control, or they're in connivance with Zionists, and they are Zionists. So it shows that none of those three guys are Jewish, but they are Zionists. So you don't have, as Biden said, you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. In fact, you can hate Jews and be a Zionist. So
All the
it's
best Zionists did. I mean, the Jewish and the non-Jewish Zionists. So Herzl was. I remember reading Herzl for the first time when I was in college, and that was my first brush with Western anti-Semitism. And it was, I mean, he was just flat out saying, "Look, we are just never going to make it in Europe. We're never going to fit in with the Europeans. We're never going to be like the Europeans.
And he says it's
We."
our fault. It's like he said, the Jews carry the seed of anti-Semitism. So it's not that, Europe is a really tough place and that's that. So maybe we should think about something else. It's like it's our fault. And that, I mean, that's what's that sorry to interrupt you. That's what's so insane about Zionist ideology is not only they say it's our fault, so they say the solution is that we convert from a religion into a national movement. We abandon all of the theology and godliness and pious behavior and everything that has defined Judaism for thousands of years and just become like nationalists. And that was the idea of Zionism. I mean, it was laid out by Herzl,
Oh, absolutely. And none of these people were religious. I mean, they had
right?
already gotten rid of Judaism as a religion. They were all atheists and socialists. And for them, Judaism was just an identity. And for them, I think, I mean, the extent of their anti Semitism is that they believed that they could not get rid of their Judaism. They thought, for Herzl, his plan A was he was trying to convince the Pope that to convert all the Jews into
Yes,
Catholicism, and
yes.
then he realized, no, that's never going to work. We're never going to fit in. We're just we're not good enough. Almost, we're too different. We're not going to be able to fit in, and then we need to move there. And of course, he was asked at some point, "What makes you think that the average European Jew is going to want to leave?" I forget the exact cities that were mentioned, but it was maybe Vienna or Berlin or something like that. Some, fine civilized European city at that time. You know, early 19th century, early 20th, late 19th century. They'd started getting industrialization there, and they were massively ahead of place like Palestine, where industrialization was still further behind. And so the notion that, and they asked him, why do you think people would leave Vienna or Budapest and go to Palestine? And he said, leave it to the anti Semites. And that's exactly what happened. In fact, I mean, that's what the motivation of Lord Balfour was. This is what the British Zionists wanted. They knew that they were going to be faced with the problem of Jewish migration into Britain from Eastern Europe. And they knew that the best solution for that would be Zionism, because then we can just ship them all off to the Middle East and they won't have to come here. This has always been a current, and it continues until today. I mean, you see all these Christian evangelical Zionist morons, the ones who think that they're, going to bring in the apocalypse and Jesus and all of that stuff. I mean, they're obviously morons that are being played by Zionist intelligence agencies to believing this garbage. But within their stupid little brains, there's, I mean, as ridiculous and idiotic as their ideas are, and as criminal as they are, there's still the very anti-Semitic idea that these Jews are going to get massacred. So they think we're going to be sending the Jews there, and then there's going to be an apocalypse, and then Jesus is going to return, and they're all going to get killed. And of course, for the Zionists, it's like, okay, yeah, yeah, you're going to get us killed, but for now, give us all the money and the weapons that we need, and then when the Messiah comes along, we'll figure it out, which works very well for them because they get to take the weapons right now, and these idiots continue to believe they're con artist priests and think that this is what Jesus wanted. That Jesus wanted them to murder people for having wrong religion and wrong ethnicity.
Right. Even, it totally undermines at the same time, it totally undermines the idea that Zionism is Judaism because, I mean, the vast majority, those evangelical Zionists, they outnumber Jewish Zionists by huge margins. So, I mean, what's interesting, if you look at the history of Zionism before it was adopted by, Herzl or any of his ideological predecessors, it was popularized in Britain by Protestant Christians, and so it was really a Protestant idea that was later adopted by uh, you know by Jewish Zionists. I mean, it's such a the terminology is so strange. Like to me, even the idea of Jewish Zionism is it's an oxymoron because Zionism is anti-Jewish. It's all about abandoning Judaism. So it's the language kind of fails, but um but it was Christian before it was adopted by Jews, and not, of course, not all Christians, a very kind of specific, sort of, I guess, sect of them in Britain at the time. But
Yeah, Herzl, when he wanted the first Zionist Congress was held in Basel in Switzerland. That was not his plan A. He wanted to first hold it in Munich, and the
right,
reason he didn't want to, the reason he wasn't able to hold it in Munich, it was not because of the evil Aryan anti-Semites. It was because of the Jewish anti-Zionists who thought, no, this is a terrible idea, and it was a deeply unpopular idea with European Jews initially because it was going to put them to the test of their loyalty, and they didn't want this idea that you as a German now need to start to have loyalty for some other country, and then the rest of the German people are going to look at you and say, are you German or are you Israeli? So this was never a popular idea because German Jews consider themselves German, Italian Jews consider themselves Italian. These identities were not in conflict until Zionism came about, and then it made the position of a Jewish European look suspect because are you is your loyalty for our country or is your loyalty for the other country? So that's why that's part of the reason why Jews opposed it. But I think, of course, I mean, I'm no theological expert, but I think you're right in that there seems to be very good ground for disagreement between Judaic teachings and the idea of a modern nation state carrying the religion, because it doesn't look like that religion was made to have a modern nation state run by a bunch of crooks like Netanyahu and all of these people. That
right,
doesn't sound very religiously holy to me, but who knows?
right. Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, firstly, to your point about Germany, and I mean, Hitler actually saw Zionists as like a confirmation of his beliefs about Jews. He wrote, I have the quote here. He wrote in Mein Kampf. Um, he wrote, "Whatever doubts I may still have nourished were finally dispelled by the attitude of a portion of the Jews themselves. Among them, there was a great movement, quite extensive in Vienna, which came out sharply in confirmation of the national character of the Jews. This was the Zionists." So he saw Zionism as a confirmation of his belief that Jews were not Germans. Jews could not be Germans, but they were actually another nation, which was, which was Zionism. And so, you see the kind of the sort of twin ideologies or the symbiotic relationship between Nazism and Zionism. And precisely to your point, the overwhelming majority of Jews, religious and reform, at that point rejected Zionism. The religious saw it as idol worship, which they still do to this day, because you're basically worshiping land, which is completely forbidden in Judaism, and you are violating the teachings, the rules of the Torah. It's a total violation of the entire religion, and so they were totally opposed to it. And in fact, Herzl ended up, basically because he had no way to get he didn't have any way to get Jews to go along with this. He decided to basically take the logic, or take Jewish theology and transform it into like a nationalist mythology. So and to construct a nationalist mythology. So that is what, they just basically took Judaism, emptied it of all of its content, and just all of the holiness and all of the religious aspects, and filled it with this nationalism. And so Jews at the time recognized it as totally fake, but over time, because of political events, Jews ended up, some of them went to Palestine and formed the Zionist movement. And then, decades later, I mean, it was Zionist propaganda became more and more successful, to the point where there is, of course, there are many Jews, particularly, one of the things I've found is the more secular you are, the more of a secular Jew you are, the more likely you are to be Zionist. So it shows that the more religious you are, the more likely you are to be anti-Zionist. So it shows that the Jewish religion is actually the ideological resistance to Zionism.
Yeah, I think this is a very astute point, and I think I had an Israeli friend who once told me this, which really kind of struck with me, which is that Jewish traditions are actually more alive in the diaspora than the, well, I wouldn't even call it diaspora, but I would say outside of Palestine than in Israel, because in Israel, essentially, people's belonging has been hijacked into nationalism. Whereas American Jews and European Jews continue to have a lot more of a Jewish identity rather than an Israeli identity. So you see more of this. And I'd never thought of it this way, but I think there is some truth to that. Wouldn't you agree?
Definitely. I mean, the vast majority of Jews in Israel are uh, what religious Jews would consider idol worshippers. They're sinners. They're partaking. The secular ones are sinners because in the same way that they would consider me a sinner, I'm secular. But it's even worse because they're in the Holy Land. I mean, Judaism considers Palestine, southern Lebanon, that area is Holy Land, but not in a political way. There's no national claim to it. It's just that Jews consider that sacred land, and it has religious or holy characteristics to it. And so to go partake in a nationalist project there is an even greater is a very grave sin. And so the religious ones are even kookier because they've basically taken this sinful project and assigned holiness to it. So it's even more of a contradiction. There is a um, small there is a community of traditional religious Jews. I mean, there are religious Jews who reject Zionism in Israeli society. There are kind of different approaches. Some of them thought, well, we are not Zionists. However, we we should have representation in Israel's parliament, the Knesset, in order to advance our interests. Those ones kind of get sucked in and they collaborate with Zionists and they become part of the system. And those are a lot of the political party United Torah Judaism, for example, represents that stream. You have the Neturei Karta, which are very interesting. They, for example, so they live in a neighborhood in Jerusalem called Mea Shearim, and they are completely anti-Zionist. They do not interact with Israeli society at all. They consider themselves Palestinian Jews. They want to live under as a Jewish minority in an Arab state. And in fact, one of the well, he's passed away now, but Rabbi Hirsch, he was the Jewish affairs advisor to Yasser Arafat. Um, so they want good relations with the Palestinians and consider themselves, yes, part of the Palestinian nation. And on Israeli Independence Day, which was just a few weeks ago, what they do every year is they burn an Israeli flag. And there are videos that have gone around in the last 6 7 months of them being beaten by Israeli police. So it shows the real contradiction, the difference between Zionism and Judaism, um, and that's so it does exist in you know, Israel. But these are Jews who consider themselves Palestinians. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Incidentally, it just occurs to me right now, wouldn't the Israeli flag be considered idolatry?
absolutely, absolutely. To have the Jewish symbol on there, absolutely, they totally oppose that. Yeah, they don't want. Yeah, they're exactly the entire state of Israel. Everything is all for them is completely heretical.
I see. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, well, I wanted to talk about Gaza. So tell us about how you got into Gaza and what you saw there. Tell us about your movie, and yeah, leading up to now.
Sure. So I got to Palestine in 2014. I kind of dove headfirst into journalism there, and then there was the 2014 Israeli war on Gaza, which lasted for 51 days, and about 40 or so days in, I managed to get a press card from the Israeli government press office, which granted me passage through Erez crossing, which goes from Israel into Gaza. And so I jumped at the opportunity. So I went to Gaza during the beginning of a 5-day ceasefire, and basically started filming, though I didn't know really what I was filming for, or didn't have the idea of making a documentary. But myself, along with Max Blumenthal, we made the documentary "Killing Gaza," and so that first trip, began or was the first of several trips to Gaza, where I the first one was a week or two long. I stayed after the end of the temporary ceasefire. I stayed for through the final ceasefire. Um, and then I just continued to go back, and I would spend anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks at a time in Gaza, documenting basically people living in the rubble, under siege, unable to rebuild through the winter, through the summer, um, and showing what it was like living in this concentration camp, uh, well, basically, there was a quote unquote ceasefire, and that ceasefire involved Israel shooting at people on a daily basis, shooting at farmers along the walls, and I was reporting from Gaza at the time, and so I would just go back and forth as much as I could, as long as I had that privilege, and so that became the documentary "Killing Gaza," which we released in 2018. And you can watch it. You can go to killinggaza.com. You can watch it there for like $5 to buy it, or I've put it on my YouTube channel a few years ago for free on Uncaptured Media. Or I guess several months ago I put it there. It's free on YouTube. You can find it there. It's in like 6 or 7 different languages. So um yeah, so that became the documentary "Killing Gaza," and then in 2021, I made another documentary without going there, um, called "Gaza Fights Back," and that covers the 2021 war, in which Hamas actually intervened in Jerusalem because of these Israeli provocations at the Al-Aqsa compound, or the Temple Mount, and basically it documents that war, for lack of a better term. um and so it's kind of, those movies are in basically prequels in a way to the current genocide. um so yeah, basically that's it.
Yeah, I think that they're a very good background because, again, I've said this too many times today, but I guess doesn't hurt to say it again. But generally, people's perspective is just completely warped by this idea of the propaganda that is presented in the West. Which I think, if you really want to break it down, and here at the Bitcoin Standard podcast, we are world experts at breaking down bullshit fiat propaganda. And if you've gotten into a stage, if you got into a stage in your life where you've figured out Bitcoin and you have been able to hold Bitcoin for a while, you haven't done that without busting an enormous amount of propaganda, because that requires going against the brainwashing that you received about money, about central banking, about all kinds of horrible things. And so if you're able to break out of that, then it becomes a lot easier for you to see the bullshit everywhere and to figure it out everywhere. And so let me give you my sort of very quick way of busting all of the propaganda that you see around the conflict. And I think Dan's movies do a great job of showing this. The way that it is portrayed is based on this algorithm. Every single thing done by the Israeli government or any Israeli citizen is always a justified reaction to whatever any Palestinian has done. And absolutely nothing that a Palestinian can do is ever a justified reaction for anything that Israel or the Israeli government can do. And so it doesn't get any clearer than this. There's a military occupation. Everybody understands the idea that military uh, personnel and soldiers should not be rooting around civilians. And nobody likes to have military around civilians, and nobody wants to live under military occupation. And everybody understands that it's okay to resist military occupation. And yet, any act of resistance against Israeli military is used as an excuse for any kind of retaliation by the Israeli military against Palestinian civilians. And so Israel can steal land, Israel can take people's homes. Israel can demolish people's homes. Israel can kick people out of their homes purely for the fact that they are not Jewish, which happens all the time, happens every single day since the creation of Israel. This has been something that's been ongoing, nonstop, and that is all just it's either doesn't get reported, and if it does get reported, it's always placed in the context of, well, they're retaliating for something the Palestinians did, and the Palestinians cannot retaliate for anything. There's no amount of aggression that the Israelis can do that justifies any kind of response from the Palestinians. But if you were to be fair minded about it, if you were to look at this as somebody with a functioning brain that hasn't been damaged by decades of propaganda, you'll come to a very different conclusion. There's a very clear aggressor here. The Palestinian people were living in this land for hundreds of years. They own their property. They are not, under any stretch of the imagination, under an obligation to give up this property, because people coming from abroad on boats have all kinds of stories about why they deserve to have your property more. And this is something that realistic and intelligent Zionist leaders understood. Ben Gurion said this, Moshe Dayan said this. Let's not kid ourselves. We came here, we kicked them out, we used our guns to kick them out of their homes. And we are being ridiculous when we think that they are just going to get over it. And it's amazing that people can have that idea in their mind while at the same time continue to think, nope, nothing the Palestinians can do is justified. Everything they do is unjustified. And everything that Israel does in retaliation is okay and acceptable. And we're seeing this now, obviously. Israel is just systematically going around trying to kill as many people as they can, and to make Gaza as uninhabitable, to try and kick out as many Palestinians as they can. And it's all being thought of as if it is self defense, which is insane.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's been the same media narrative for so long, and it's really not working anymore. I mean, you see the damage that it's done to Biden's reelection chances, even though the idea of a second Biden term is kind of unthinkable just because of Biden's mental the degradation of his mental faculties. But nonetheless, I mean, clearly they want to get him in there again, and you can see how much it's damaged that possibility. And I just I see a huge shift in consciousness here in the United States of how people see the quote unquote conflict. I mean, it's average people who I think would never probably have much to say about it. They're seeing the images on a daily basis of dead kids, dead Palestinian kids, of just wanton slaughter of civilians, and it's pretty shocking. And so Israel's really destroying all of the image, uh, the kind of goodwill that the I think American public has. Um, towards it. And so I don't know, I really have my instinct, my gut tells me that we're really seeing, I mean, for a number of reasons, the end of Zionism. I mean, obviously Israel is completely dependent on the United States for its military, diplomatic, political support. If the lifeline of weapons were cut off, then Israel just could not fight. It could not continue, not even fight, it couldn't continue to just slaughter. And that's the only thing that's keeping it going, because it can't actually do anything against the resistance, the armed resistance in Gaza, which is, you know, basically in a vast, complex tunnel system, and the Israelis just have no answer to that. So, in order to keep this thing going, they just drop bombs on multi-story homes full of families that can't escape. Um, and so that's destroying Israel's image as some kind of like Western democracy that just has a terrorism issue. Um, and uh, and then politically, internally in Israel, you basically have the Israeli kind of liberal, polite society that hates Netanyahu already. There have been long, big protests against him for years that really threatened the instability of the Zionist project. Um, and now you have, So there are mass protests all the time because Israel has decided, well, Netanyahu has decided there's not going to be a ceasefire. There's not going to be any negotiations for an exchange of prisoners. Um, and so he's alienated a big portion of the society. And then when he's alienating the other, I think basically he'll alienate the right as soon as there's, if and when there's some kind of ceasefire. If he agrees to a ceasefire at some point, then the right will hate him. They'll be extremely angry at him because he'll have failed to deliver on his goal of defeating his stated goal of defeating Hamas and expelling Palestinians into Egypt and building settlements in Gaza. And so, really, it seems like his only option is to expand the war into Lebanon, which the United States doesn't really want to do, and it's unclear if the United States will actually go along with it, or if that will be the if that division between the US and Israel will kind of exacerbate. Um so I mean, Netanyahu is really, I think, destroying Israel. Um and it's just,
Yeah.
it's so unstable. It's just, it's hard to imagine this the future. It's obviously not going to be the same, but it's like, I think Israel's just, it's the logic of Zionism is the contradictions are falling away, it's coming to its end, is my sense.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's difficult to have that kind of optimism in this bleakness, and there is a strong case to be made for the exact opposite case, which is that this is Zionism's finest hour. They are gearing up to take off over the rest of Palestine because, I mean, they've probably killed at least 100,000 people so far. All the numbers of 40,000, I think, are massively understated. So there's at least 100,000 probably killed in Gaza. I think several hundred thousands would leave any chance they get. So demographically, they're really making damage there. They're annexing the West Bank. They're working on trying to do as much land grab as possible and to try and expel as many Palestinians as possible from there. I think I agree with you. I'm not so sure on your issue about whether the US is on board or not. I don't think the US has any agency. There is no such thing as the US. The US is essentially a puppet that the Israelis control. I think the last 6 months made it pretty clear. There, the Israeli government says jump, and the Americans just say how high. There is no sense of. There's no. I think it's at a point where people who think the U.S. is not a puppet state of the Israelis, I don't think they could even make a coherent case for who is in charge of the U.S. or what is in charge of the U.S. or what is the geopolitical vision of the U.S. What is the U.S. trying to do? What's the point of the U.S.'s existence in the Middle East in the first place? Why did they even send soldiers there? What are they trying to do? What are they trying to achieve? There are no answers to any of those questions. There are no sane answers. If you cared about the US, you wouldn't have a single, I mean, if you really cared about the interest of the US, you wouldn't have a single American soldier in the Middle East. You wouldn't need any soldiers there. You wouldn't need to intervene in any of those wars. You can buy all the oil that you want without having to engage in imperialism. People in Ecuador and in Switzerland and in Kenya, they can all buy all the oil they want, just like people in the US. They all go to their local gas station and they all pay and they get gas into their car. And they don't need to go and fight wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and do regime change in order to get that oil. So there is no interest for the US. And I think, I don't think the US is holding back Israel from war with Lebanon. I think it might be the case that Israel's military establishment is the one that is worried about this because it might be the case that is Israel's military establishment that is delaying engagement in Lebanon. I don't think it is the U.S. And I think the if they do get involved, I think the plan is there's going to be a U.S. carrier that's going to come, and then Hezbollah have done this before. They've targeted Americans in Lebanon. I don't think they would pass up the opportunity to do something like this. And then if the Americans are targeted, then of course that's going to get Americans really excited about getting into war, and that's exactly what Israel wants. So then it can fight its war
on Lebanon with full on American support, because then your average American idiot is going to start cheering on with a lot more enthusiasm for the murder of Middle Eastern people, because, you know, targeting American soldiers is not okay, apparently. It's only okay when it's done by Israel as a part of a false flag like USS Liberty, in which case we just forget about it and never talk about it. But if it's done by somebody else, then, we need to go to war.
I think the U.S. establishment. I mean, I think the U.S. establishment does not want war with like Hezbollah and Iran, because, for example, the um when Israel bombed the Iranian what was it, consulate or embassy in Damascus, and killed like an Iranian general, and then Iran retaliated, kind of did this whole psychological warfare for a week and a half, and everyone's guessing what is Iran going to do, and finally they launched these strikes, and it was, I mean, in my opinion, it was actually kind of strategic genius, because um it it sent a strong message. It didn't really cost Iran much, and it also got it basically, the Israelis were forced to show their defense. Um and it also showed who would come to the aid of Israel. And so that attack happened, and then Israel's response was pretty much nothing, because the US told them, look, uh we're not going to go into a full war with Iran. We're not going to go into a war with Iran with you right now. So you better just take this victory, take it, swallow it, call it a victory. And so that's what they did. They claimed they carried out some strike, but the Iranians, said, we don't we don't know about any strike. What are you even talking about? So, I mean, I think basically, and this is, there's been reporting also to sort of back up my position here, is that the US is perfectly happy to keep this genocide going as long as Israel wants, but they just want to keep it contained to Gaza, because they understand that if you start destabilizing the entire region, then Israel's existence even is at stake. And so, like, the US is their the US position is, let's just keep going with the status quo, which is total phony talk of a two-state solution, while Israel continues to gobble up the West Bank. And you just maintain the Palestinian Authority with foreign, with American and European money, and training PA forces to crack down on resistance. And that maintains that, keep funneling money, giving money to Egypt, to maintain the siege on Gaza, as well as other geopolitical considerations in Northern Africa. Um, basically just maintain the status quo is, I think, the US's idea, but there's a deep fundamental change that's happened inside Israel, which rejects the status quo. And in some sense, in some ways, I think makes sense, because, the right-wing position in Israel has been, these people are our enemies. How can we live with them, right next to us? They could attack us. And that's essentially what happened on October 7th. The right was sort of, in a way, vindicated, because the kind of establishment position in Israel for years and years, the Oslo position has been, look, we, give them, we just basically separate from them. We have an apartheid state. We pay collaborators to repress them, and as long as they stay over there in their refugee camps and their little hamlets in the West Bank, then fine. And same in Gaza, just stay in Gaza and whatever. But you know that obviously that was totally discredited. That whole conception was totally discredited on October 7th. And the right wing, which was already winning in Israel and was totally ascendant, their concept has won in Israeli society, which is, we have to commit genocide, just kill them all. There's no question about it. So That's what they're trying to do. But I think that that's the division to me, is that the US is thinking more in terms of like kind of realpolitik in a way, that it's, this is what we have to do. This is not about morality or any considerations like that, but we have to do what we have to do in order to maintain the Zionist project. And the Zionist project is like, no, we want to like blow everything up. So I think that's the difference. And there was a statement even a few days ago, I'd have to look who it was from, but from, some top US military official saying, we do not support a war against Hezbollah. There was another one, saying something along the lines of the opposite. But so, I mean, I do think you're right that the US is an occupied country in terms of, our government is under control of Zionists, but I think um it doesn't fall exactly along national lines. Like they're sort of competing ideologies. Neoconservatives are hardcore Zionists. They want to completely remake the Middle East. They tried to do that. Um, but I don't know. I think there is a division between the US and Israel in some ways. And I think where we would see that is if Israel tries to go to war, have a full war against Lebanon, which they cannot do without the total full backing of the United States. And that would be a suicide mission anyway, because, if you get into a war with Hezbollah, which is much stronger than Hamas, then Israel's not really going to survive that. It's already in extremely bad shape. Um, and then there opens the potential of Iran getting involved, which could do a lot of very serious damage and even destroy Israel. So, um, I mean, I don't know. I do think there is some division, but just not enough.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on something which I believe is, um, maybe this is just me imagining things, but I think there is a fundamental contradiction that makes Zionism unsustainable, which is that, being that it is an ideology that is built on theft, being built on the idea that we're going to justify taking other people's stuff because bad thing happened to us, and also because God said so in a book, and also because we are chosen, and also because of all of these different reasons, wherein standard morality that everybody in the world understands no longer applies to us. I think if you try and pass off a lie like this, you cannot do it. I don't think you can live with yourself very easily. And on an internal level, but also as on a societal basis, the problem here becomes that you might have some kind of, think of the original founders of Israel. Think of people like Rabin, who may have the kind of practical vision of Zionism that is not too bad, which, let's face it, might have been acceptable to maybe a majority of Palestinians at a certain point. I mean, there is perhaps an alternative world in which, if Rabin wasn't assassinated and if the far right in Israel in the early 90s was a lot weaker than it would actually was, that they couldn't assassinate him, they could rally people. If Goldstein hadn't done the massacre in Hebron where he killed 30 Palestinians while they were praying in the mosque, those two events, they really were what derailed the peace process. And that's when Hamas started retaliating with the suicide bombings, and that's when things fell apart. And that was exactly the agenda of the fundamentalist Zionists, who didn't want the peace process. They wanted to derail it because they didn't want the peace process, because they didn't want to have a Palestinian state. They didn't want Palestinians. They wanted to get all of the West Bank and then get Gaza. And 20 years down the line, it seems to be working. There are a lot more Jewish settlers in the West Bank, and they are closer than ever to getting rid of the Palestinians in Gaza. So you might argue it's working. But I think you may say that early Zionism, that kind of practical Zionism might have worked. Maybe the Palestinians might have accepted a state in the West Bank and Gaza if somebody like Rabin had offered it in the 90s, and if settlements didn't grow, and if all of these things could happen. But I still think it's difficult for this to survive as a project, because if you start off with the idea that we can take other people's stuff, you can't stop that. You can't have this kind of rabbin middle ground where, all right, we can take your stuff up until 1948, we can take some more stuff in 1967, but then we're going to start becoming civilized, moral human beings, and we're going to shake hands and stop taking stuff. Doesn't seem to be a very coherent position, and it's not a tenable position for somebody. I think as an Israeli, you're going to eventually, it's not an equilibrium. You're going to either settle on the position of nope, taking stuff from other people is wrong, whether it's done today or it was done in 1948, or you're going to settle on the other alternative position, which is taking stuff from people is okay, then or now, anytime, because it's us and not them, and because of all these reasons. So therefore, let's take more stuff. And this is where I think we are right now. I think the ruling current in Israel is very much on team. We need to take more stuff, and the only questions now are, all right. I mean, I guess if you ask right now, a majority want Gaza. Probably a majority want the West Bank as well, and they want to get rid of all the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I think the only question that is probably contentious at this point is whether south of Lebanon should be part of Israel. And I think when you talk, when you listen to some of the more fundamentalist people, it's pretty clear in their mind that we are just getting started. The West Bank and Gaza are just stepping stones. The land of Israel is from the Euphrates to the Nile. And they're going to keep picking a lot more fights. And then they're going to continue to steal stuff in self defense, as they've been doing for 80 years. And this is, I think, the agenda for the people that are in power in Israel. This is what the Smotrich and the Ben Gvirs, I think, are believing. And this is why I think it's. I think, first of all, the whole notion of we're just going to go back to having a two-state solution is completely meaningless and dead in the water. But I think trying to imagine that, all right, well, they're just going to kill the Palestinians and kick them out of the West Bank and Gaza, and then they're going to have a civilized, peaceful Israeli society on all of historical Palestine. I don't think that's a stable equilibrium either, because it's they want more land, and they're going to keep creating more conflict and creating more refugees, which is going to create more conflict, which is going to allow them more excuses to take on more land. And I think the interesting question to pose here for my listeners who are not from the region, and if you think that this is just some kind of passing interest, I think perhaps you might want to start considering what it means when you see this kind of ideology developing, where people have developed this idea that anything they can do to people from the outgroup is justified. Where are the limits? So West Bank and Gaza, all right, well, south of Lebanon, Jordan, parts of Egypt, parts of Syria, parts of Iraq. But then, what makes you so sure that this won't be tried in New York at some point, or parts of New York, or other parts of the world? I mean, the same formula can be applied. The percentage, I think New York has about an 8% Jewish population, which is around the Jewish population in Palestine around 1917, 1918, probably 1922, closer to that. Right around the Balfour Declaration, or a few years after the Balfour Declaration, that was the percentage of the Jewish population in Palestine. And look how that worked out. So why not do something like this in New York? I mean, there are already Zionists in power in New York, and they are already completely compromised and will absolutely do anything for Israel. None of these politicians will talk about the USS Liberty. None of them will talk about all of the roles that Israel has done in entrapping the US in wars. So maybe this can be carried on forward all over the world. Maybe it can be tried in other places, because we are, I think, dealing with the only real ideology that very openly says it's okay to kill people and take their stuff if they are not from the in group. And this is something, again, go back to the ridiculousness of all the race hustling that you hear about in the US. I mean, people like to bring up the scarecrow of white nationalism and Christian nationalism and white supremacy in the US. And I spent some time looking at the platforms of people like David Duke or the American Nazi Party. And if you did, and I encourage people to go check out whoever you think is the most awful extremist in US politics, go check out his agenda
and replace the word whites in everything that he says, white Americans or Christian Americans, let's say, replace that with Jewish Israelis, and then replace the blacks or the browns or the Muslim Americans with Palestinians, and then see where that fits on the Israeli political spectrum. And you'll find that the most abhorrent, uh, completely beyond the pale figure in American politics, the kind of guy who will never make it onto CNN, the kind of guy who will never be discussed in the New York Times except in some kind of passing, just in, when they're doing a smear job on somebody else, they're going to mention this guy as being associated with them. His political platform will probably be something like middle, centrist Israeli position. I mean, if your idea of if you're a beyond the pale white supremacist in the U.S., I mean, maybe you're calling for the deportation of illegal immigrants. If you're really, 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 really out there, you're calling for the deportation of some of the recent migrants who have been naturalized. Uh, but I don't think you'll find anything similar to what the most mainstream voices in Israel support, which is we need to take more land. We need to lock these people up. We need to control their lives. We need to make sure that, I mean, the Israeli Minister of Security, Ben Gvir, says, look, the right of a Jewish family to be able to drive around in the West Bank is more important than anything about the rights of the Palestinians. It's very simple, very straightforward. You don't get people saying things like that anywhere near American politics. And I think um, it's time for people to start to consider what are the implications of this becoming more and more popular, and more powerful, and more well financed all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, I see it as, Zionism is basically a model that can be applied anywhere where it's, whatever sort of racial group, or it doesn't even have to be racial. I mean, any kind of in group, out group, this kind of logic can be applied. And really, I think, Palestinians are kind of the canary in the coal mine. I mean, which is why I think it's really important for everyone, especially Americans, to oppose this, not just because, if you don't sympathize with Palestinians, if a picture of a kid whose family was killed doesn't really move you because it's on the other side of the world, and you know doesn't have anything to do with you, other except for our tax dollars are funding it, then okay. But you know we should understand that this actually is being applied to us in a way. The way that Israel, uh, sells equipment, and its tactics are used around the world. The way that it's those strategies are basically implemented in different situations around the world is very real. And so Zionism is really, it's not only, you know Palestinians are the first victims, but unless we stop it, they won't be the last.
Yeah, absolutely. I really believe this is the case, and I think there was a time when I would think this, and I would think, no, this is just me being a Palestinian trying to get everybody involved in my fight. But I think the morality of people's actions and people's beliefs have enormous implications that carry through in their lives, and they have consequences, and you can't just escape these consequences by saying, well, I'm just going to pay for this and support it and let it happen away from me. No, I think normalizing this concept of, in some cases, we can, as civilized human beings, accept that some people are going to take other people's stuff and murder them purely because they belong to the wrong identity. That's just undermining the basis of civilization, undermining the basis of human coexistence, undermining the ability for humans to have a society. Because if we move into this world where, okay, it's okay for me sometimes to take your stuff in this situation, and sometimes it might be okay for him to take his stuff and her to take her stuff or something like that, then that's just a recipe for endless conflict. And we see this being reflected in how this conflict is polarizing the world all over the world. You see people in Europe, in America, in the Middle East, everywhere. In offices all over the world, people are fighting about this, and it's becoming very polarizing because it's a very, very clear example of injustice, and at the same time, a very clear example of people in a very
important positions of power and authority blatantly and blindly saying we are going to be for this injustice because of stupid reasons we've cooked up. And that's just going to undermine the basis of justice everywhere. Yeah. So, what are your thoughts about things moving forward? How do you see things unfolding in Gaza? I mean, it almost feels too sick to be asking this question at this point, but
Right.
what do you think?
Well, I mean, it's clear that Israel's incapable of achieving its stated goals in Gaza, namely, defeating Hamas. That's not going to happen. So the options are, um, either Israel just continues to wage this genocidal war on Gaza indefinitely, um, and as that kind of peters out, Netanyahu looks for the next um, arena, which of course would be Lebanon. Um, but I don't know if that's going to be politically tenable in Israel or in the United States. I mean, I think actually even I saw a headline today that Sarah Netanyahu warned that a military coup is coming. I think there are some among the Israeli military establishment. I think is more sort of tied to the U.S. Than um, Netanyahu directly. Netanyahu is much more looking out for his own interests because as soon as if there is a ceasefire and the war ends, then is the Israeli public is going to come for his head because he's the architect of October 7th. He said, well, we'll just keep them in Gaza and we'll support Hamas in order to maintain the division among the Palestinians, and there can never be a Palestinian state. That obviously, we can see what that led to. That failed. Um, and so he has to keep this going as long as possible because, and he also has his legal problems, which are not going away. So um, either something is going to be imposed on Israel one way or another through whether that's through the U.S. basically eventually forcing him out of power and a weakened Israel to have some kind of negotiated ceasefire, or um, the military removing him, or an even more destructive war with Lebanon that could basically physically destroy the state of Israel. I think those are basically the options at this point. Um, and it just we'll see. There are kind of so many elements kind of at play that it's impossible to predict. But I think those are basically the options.
Yeah, I think I think I agree with you, but I would say that there is probably a case to be made that Israel's stated goals are not its actual goals,
Oh,
and
definitely.
that the longer the fight goes on, the better for them. Because for them, the problem is that Israel relies on the U.S. for weapons, and we saw this. From the first day of the war, they needed billions of dollars of weapons in order to carry on this war. If the U.S. had become an independent state on October 6th, and then on October 7th, they told Israel, sorry, American weapons are for American military. It sounds so funny to say it because you're just so normalized to understand the idea of the U.S. as a puppet state of Israel. But imagine that they had actually become an independent state, and then Israel's fight would have been over. But the thing that makes it harder to get weapons and support from abroad is deliberately targeting civilians. So they can't just go and kill people. They need to continuously shoot at Hamas and hope to kill people. And so there's this very perverse situation wherein Hamas and the Israelis want Hamas to survive up to a point because for Hamas, it allows them to stay alive. And for the Israelis, it allows them to keep killing Palestinians because that's the real enemy, because that's ultimately the real enemy for Zionism. Zionism's real wars have been fought against Palestinian civilians, always have been, always will be. That's the real enemy. They don't care about militaries. Foreign Arab militaries aren't going to be the real issue here. And so I think that the long term The bad news is that I mean, it's not just that it's a humanitarian catastrophe, it's that it's deepening the catastrophe and deepening the chances that there is no recovery from this. And that's the really, really scary thing about it.
Yeah, I mean, the real goal is not to, you know, defeat Hamas, obviously, because if that were the case, they would differentiate between resistance and civilians, but they of course don't. And in fact, their real strategy is, well, at least it has been, what's called the Dahia doctrine, which was um, basically it's to punish the civilians for supporting the resistance and thinking that that will break the back. But they have no other choice than to resist. So people, the more they punish the civilians, the more the support for the resistance grows. And the more the resistance is able to replenish its ranks. I mean, when you're a 15-year-old 14, 15-year-old boy whose family has been exterminated, what else are you going to do? And I saw that myself, in Gaza. I talked to many young boys and young men, and they're in my documentary. You can see them in Killing Gaza, who had suffered horrific, um, not tragedies, but crimes, had their families, their loved ones killed by Israel, and so they want to join the resistance naturally, as anyone would. Um, and so there was a piece in Foreign Affairs, the flagship kind of foreign policy magazine in the United States, by Robert Pape, who is he's considered one of the foremost terrorism experts, and he wrote a few days ago how Israel is losing the war because it's killing and of civilians and destruction of civilian infrastructure is actually strengthening Hamas. It's strengthening the resistance. So I think part of it is, Israel as a colonial entity is incapable of understanding the mindset of resistance and of the Palestinians. And so they think, it's like Israel thinks it has like a huge, wet floor and it's using a mop to clean it up when it's actually really using like a hose. So the more it bombs, the more it kills, the more conditions worsen and people just support the resistance more because there's nothing left. There is no other option that it's like, well, if I'm going to die, I might as well die fighting and give my people a chance of surviving, of coming out of this. And also, I think it's pretty clear that Hamas is has I mean in my opinion, Hamas has already won this because there's different, Hamas doesn't have to have a military victory over Israel to win. Hamas has to survive as an entity, as a resistance movement. It doesn't even have to, be governing Gaza. It just has to be a resistance movement that the West can't defeat. Israel, in order to have a victory, has to actually defeat Hamas. So there's different standards of what victory is. Israel cannot achieve it. And so by default, if Israel can't achieve its victory, then Hamas wins. And so it's basically, in my mind, just a matter of eventually the world is going to be forced to admit that. And, when that comes, I don't know. I mean, I wish it were right now. It's like it's just so jarring. We're what, 8, almost 9 months into this, and it's just every day there's just constant massacres. It's 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 just inconceivable that this is happening, but I think Israel's just destroying itself.
I don't know. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure I buy this idea. I saw that article by Robert Pape, but and I get it from a kind of geopolitics perspective. Like if you deny your opponent their goals, you win, sort of. But I mean, by that measure, Hamas has been winning every war since 2000, and well, since the Oslo Accords. But look how well that's worked out for.
Well, there's a huge, 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 obviously cost to civilians, and I mean, I think Hamas is. logic is that, well, that's what, every anti-colonial war, whether it's Vietnam or Algeria, um, that's the nature of it, of anti-colonial wars and fighting off foreign invaders and occupations. That's the cost, and there's nothing that really can be done to mitigate that. There's no way. That's the brutality of the occupier. But all of those came to an end, and the societies regenerated and healed, and certainly have their lasting traumas, and no doubt that Gaza and Palestine have theirs. But I mean, I personally, I'm optimistic about the future, but the price, I mean, being paid right now is almost unbearable. I mean, and that's for me, just as someone who's spent time in Gaza. I don't have any personal or familial connection there, but knowing these places that are being destroyed and the people, and is just uh it's extremely hard to comprehend on a daily basis. I mean, and that's just for me.
Yeah, I know. I cannot argue with that, obviously. Well, can you tell us more about you and your work and where people can find you?
Basically, last year I founded Uncaptured Media. You can watch us on YouTube, Rumble, youtube.com/, I think, uncaptured. I'm very active on Twitter. You can find me at Dan Cohen 3000. Um, and if you want to see my work on Haiti, I have my documentary Killing Gaza. You can see killinggaza.com. I did a series of documentaries on Haiti that are on my Uncaptured YouTube channel, which is actually very relevant right now because the Biden administration is sending Kenyan mercenaries into Haiti to stamp out this kind of uprising that's been going on that I've been documenting. And I have a documentary that I'm working on. I'm trying to avoid sort of blowing my cover in a way, but it's about Israeli society, that is ongoing and is crowdfunded. So if he wants to, support that, it's a huge help, and just my work in general. So yeah, I very much appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. And you do take Bitcoin donations, right?
I do indeed. I think I have my Bitcoin on my link tree, on my Twitter profile, Dan Cohen 3000. It's all yeah. There's a donate, get Bitcoin, donate Ethereum link there. So yeah. So thank you so much. And anyone wants to support in any capacity, it's very much appreciated.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for everything that you do. And thank you for talking to us about it. And please keep doing it. Best of luck.
Thank you.
Cheers. Have a good day.